We are the land of counterculture. That is, we in the U.S. often rebel against the status quo, or our existing culture. Some would say counterculture is a healthy form of expression. That may be in some cases. In others, it is fueled by hatred. I do not see how that is healthy. I would also argue the ideas which are completely opposed to a given society of the time are most certainly not healthy and possibly a bad indication of where society is. I may in the future do separate videos on the countercultures which are seeking a fair acceptance in society despite race or ethnicity. I am not sure about doing a video on hating racist countercultures. My concern is that this would be insensitive to those that the hatred is directed. Why does the U.S. have all the counterculture movements it does? Why is it considered the most individualistic country in the world? In this episode, I will look at these questions. We first have to take a look at who Americans are. Half of Americans who came to the U.S. before the American Revolution came as indentured servants. That is, they were owned by someone else to pay a debt. This debt was often in exchange for being sent to the U.S. There were also kidnappings, and then they were sold into this. The indentured servitude would last a minimum of 7 years, and in most cases, quite a bit longer. They were essentially slaves. About 10% of the American population had been prisoners in Europe. They were sold into slavery to be used in the United States. About 20% were slaves brought from Africa. The remaining 20% were mostly those descended from people who had escaped brutal religious torture, persecution, and often execution in Europe. Native Americans were also enslaved in large numbers. Some of the Native American tribes, particularly the large tribes, also had African slaves. That then means 80% of those coming to the U.S. before the Revolution were slaves of one sort or another. The 13th Amendment, passed in 1865, prohibited indentured servitude just as it did slavery. There was little stability in American culture early on. When the 80% received their freedom, they had to search for opportunity. This often meant venturing or going west. Property out west was often sold cheaply by the U.S. government or given away for free. Others would trap or trade for furs from Native Americans. There was gold mining, other mining possibilities. Cowboys developed a nomadic mindset by herding cattle or bringing them to market. Railroads had to be built. A large force was created to remove Native Americans from wanted lands. Some retreated into the mountains and would live off the land. We were a people on the move, a people ready for adventure. Tens of thousands minimally died heading west. Disease was the most common death. Some would starve to death, others would die of thirst. Harsh weather killed many. Native American attacks were common, and there were many other dangers. Once slavery in its previous form was outlawed, other forms of slavery were created. There were often not any jobs for newly freed slaves. Police would pick them up on vagrancy or homeless charges, then sell them as slaves to outside bidders. Even into the 1970s, twilight laws existed in which African Americans were not allowed to be in certain towns or cities when it was dark. In the decades after the Civil War, there were quite a number of massacres of African Americans. I may do a separate video on that, as this is fairly absent from the history books. There was sharecropping of white and black Americans until the 1940s. Landowners would rent out a portion of their land and assess charges. This quickly had the sharecropper in debt, and then they were owned by the landowner. My grandfather in Louisiana was a sharecropper during the 1940s. Just 3 generations before, his 4 sets of great-grandparents each had over 10,000 acres, or more than 40 square kilometers, and raised cattle. It shows how greatly families can fall. Americans were suspicious of any authority, as it had not served them well. When they became the authority, it was often abused, as it had before them. There was no base of culture, and when a community had some culture, the next settlement over might be something completely different. There was nothing, or little, tying them down. I suppose there is a general lack of trust in our history. When community doesn't develop, then we are less likely to trust our neighbors. With the lack of community, many of them were alone in this new world. They had to defend themselves and were responsible for their own survival. This often forced the adventurer mindset. What becomes of the mindset of a society whose base was 80% enslaved and most of the other 20% were persecuted or descended from those who were persecuted for religion? I've spoken to a number of neurologists and read multiple studies about such things. I will do a future video on my findings. These scholars and studies have concluded that the rage and anger from such a lack of freedom is passed down from generation to generation. It is thought that this is passed through the mitochondria, the membranes of cells, and/or other places in the body which are too small to understand with our current science. Is this then why we are by far the most violent developed country? Abraham Maslow, a humanistic psychologist, wrote the definitive paper on motivation and identified the hierarchy of needs. In his paper, he discussed that for individuals to reach self-actualization, they had to first have their own basic needs met. This would be physiologically and emotionally. Self-actualization is meeting one's potential and developing fully psychologically. Sociologists often view society in a similar way as psychologists view individuals. I've not found a similar hierarchical study in sociology. That is, in what a society needs to go through to reach its potential psychologically. Should anyone know one, please let me know in the comments below. Maybe I will question some sociologists and ask them if there is one. A part of counterculture is the realization that parts of society or culture are not where they should be, or those of the counterculture want them to be. Is the realization must be accompanied by a fairly self-actualized mindset. Otherwise, it is likely the counterculture then makes the same level of mistakes that the overall culture made just in a different way, and very possibly causes worse mistakes, maybe far worse. Countercultures are almost entirely reactionary, instead of asking fundamental questions of what society should be. For counterculture to be effective, it must understand the mistakes of past movements, understand the structure of society, forces that shape it, the economics of everything, and to embrace a viewpoint that is not reactionary. If counterculture does not understand potential damage that can be done to a culture, then the counterculture could end up having a detrimental effect without meaning to. One example is I have heard many brilliant people, and certainly all of the major media outlets, have talked about the possibility of civil war in the U.S. as being significant. Some of the strongest countercultures in history have led to the collapse of a given civilization. A U.S. civil war could very possibly cause such a thing. In this way, I am speaking of countercultures, not having to do with race. Countercultures which are a reaction to racism and ones that are racist are a bigger societal problem. When such things exist, it is greatly costing us in that it'll guarantee that we stay far from our potential. Please subscribe and like, as that is how YouTube decides whether or not to send it on to others. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, and see you in the next episode.